You're listening to West Bend's podcast, Music for a While. We are grateful to have two sponsors for today's episode, and they are Cameco and Finley and Associates. Thank you very much for your support. Now here are Barb Hobart and Brian Finley to discuss the life and work of Rachmaninoff in episode 5, Rachmaninoff for a While.
Music is enough for a lifetime, but a lifetime is not enough for music. So wrote Sergei Rachmaninoff, an artist with a brilliant and fascinating career. But Rachmaninoff also wrote, "I feel like a ghost wandering in a world grown alien. I cannot cast out the old way of writing, and I cannot acquire the new. I've made an intense effort to feel the musical manner of today, but it will not come to me." Hi, this is Brian Finley with Music for a While. Today, Barb Hobart and I chat about the life and music of Sergei Rachmaninoff. Once again, I'll be supplying all the music you will hear on this podcast, which also includes one of Rachmaninoff's songs performed here by the wonderful Canadian soprano Leslie Fagan, and released on a CD we recorded together called Le Miroir de mon Amour. Let's start by going back to 1934 with one of the world's most cherished melodies. Here's the opening of the 18th variation from the Rhapsody on a Theme of Paganini, Opus 43, by Sergei Rachmaninoff. That was the opening of the 18th variation of Rachmaninoff's Rhapsody on a Theme of Paganini, Opus 43, composed in 1934, not that long ago. I mentioned that Barb Hobart is here with me today. Well, not exactly here, more out across the meadow and over the river. And
in my
just
studio.
Down the street a bit. Good morning, Barb.
Good morning.
I wanted to start by asking you, are you a Rachmaninoff fan?
You know what? I am. I think it's his big romantic pieces that I really love. They're very evocative, and I find that they really do elicit a very emotional response.
They do for me as well, too. It's some of my favorite driving music, as a matter of fact. And, I think it's probably because that's one of the few times in life that we actually stay put in one place and listen to something for an ongoing period of time. But anyway, let's talk about this fabulous composer. Can you take us back a little bit?
I can. He was born in northwestern Russia. His was an aristocratic family. They traced their roots back to the 15th century. There had been Grand Dukes, high-ranking military men, and wealthy landowners. But the family's fortunes and estates were lost through the profligacy of Sergei's father, who then added insult to injury by leaving his wife and 6 children to face the fallout.
Oh, dear.
Originally, Sergei and his brothers were supposed to attend a prestigious military school, but after his father's departure, that was impossible. When he was 9, his mother, who recognized his musical ability, and she also was a musician, enrolled him at the St. Petersburg Conservatory. But I love this. It's typical 9-year-old. While he was talented, he didn't possess, that inner drive. He apparently spent more time at the skating rink than at the piano.
It's wherever you learn your music, that's where you go.
And his mother had no idea, because he was falsifying his report cards.
Oh dear.
And then a teacher ratted on him.
This is before the dog ate report cards.
It was before the dog ate it, yes. So his mother sought advice from a nephew who himself was a teacher at the conservatory, and he suggested that the lad should be sent to the best piano teacher in Russia, one Nikolai Zverev, who taught at the Moscow Conservatory. Pupils like Scriabin, by the way. And he not only taught students, but he accepted some of them into his own home. He was, by all accounts, a very strict teacher, insisting on 3 hours of hard practice a day, starting sometimes at 6 in the morning. But he also saw to it that his students were exposed to opera, ballet, and theater, as well as rules of etiquette by taking them to upscale restaurants, nightclubs. There is a suggestion that he also took
let's move on a little bit, Barb, shall we?
Yeah, there is a suggestion he took them to brothels, but we'll just bypass that.
But it is really interesting that it was a very, very intensive situation. I think there was just a handful of students that lived in that house.
There were.
At a time. I think there were 3 at maximum. This would be a very intensive 5-year period of especially at that point in life, really putting your head down and digging into what you're doing. There's your 10,000 hours right there.
To become an outlier, absolutely.
Yep.
And as you say, Rachmaninoff was one of those who boarded with Zverev, but he was asked to live elsewhere. When he complained that the single practice room didn't allow him enough time for composition, because I guess he was trying to compose, other people were playing, and it disturbed his concentration.
Well, that reminds me of Clara Schumann, who was an amazing interpreter of all her husband's piano music, but she wasn't allowed to practice when he was composing.
And I'm sure afterwards, when she was alone with how many children did they have, it would have become even harder.
6 or so. Yeah.
Well, one of the people, though, that Rachmaninoff met when he was a student and who had a great influence on him, of course, was Tchaikovsky. But unfortunately, the acquaintance was very short-lived because that composer died the following year. Now, while a young man, one of Rachmaninoff's early compositions was his prelude in C-sharp minor, and I understand this work was a set of 5 pieces called Morceaux de Fantaisie. And apparently the chords in this piece are so thick that it took 4 staves to write it down rather than the usual 2. Now, can you explain to me about what it meant by the thickness of the chords?
The interesting thing about the piano music of Rachmaninoff is that he really used the piano deeply. He understood the piano in a way no other composer had up until him, with the possible exception of Chopin, I think. But it's in the Chopin tradition of being able to draw out of an instrument its full potential. And I think what Rachmaninoff added to the beautiful feeling for the hands that Chopin found at the piano. For example, when you put your hand down on a keyboard without thinking very much, you come very close to hitting a Chopin chord. So it's a very, very comfortable feeling, the music that Chopin wrote. But Rachmaninoff does a similar thing, but he uses all 10 fingers all the time. So the other interesting thing about writing on 4 staves as opposed to 2, which is typically what you see one part for the right hand and one part for the left hand. This prelude shows 2 staves for the right hand and 2 for the left hand. What this actually helps to demonstrate is it clarifies each individual part in the music. So it's a way of actually simplifying what the music should look like. And it becomes more and more like orchestral music, where you see each individual instrument on its own line.
Well, I know that Duncan Clark said, writing about Rachmaninoff, said that his pieces are very, very complex, and yet they don't particularly sound it when they're played. Would you agree with that assessment?
Well, it's hard when I'm playing them. My mind's going a million miles an hour. So I certainly feel the complexity in it, but for me, it's like a pile of treasure that's all glistening with different things here and there and here and there, and you're continually drawn by new facets and beautiful things that you see along the way.
So are we going to hear a little bit of this prelude in C-sharp minor?
Well, why not? But before that, you asked me another really interesting question when we were talking about Rachmaninoff a couple of days ago, Barb. you wondered why this piece was so famous, was so beloved. Well, I've been thinking a lot about that, and I have a few ideas, apart from his magnificent full use of the piano and also that dark sort of Russian feeling that's all the way through. There's this sense of the expected and the unexpected. The expected is the perfect cadence that we all know from 400 years of Western music. And the unexpected is that incredible mix of wonderful harmonies immediately afterwards. And he keeps going back and forth between these two ideas, which seem to become the outer soul and the inner soul. Let's listen to it now. Here's the opening of the Prelude in C-sharp minor, Opus 3, number 2, by Sergei Rachmaninoff. That was the opening of the Prelude in C-sharp minor, Opus 3, number 2.
Now, upon learning that his favorite teacher was leaving for his last year of studies, Rachmaninoff decided to take his exams early. He had to compose a vocal work, a symphony, and an opera.
Well, yeah, that's a good weekend's worth of work.
Well, the opera Alecko was completed in a mere 3 weeks. And the work was so well received that he was awarded the Great Gold Medal, which had been granted only 2 previous times. On top of that, a publisher expressed interest in publishing his work, and the Imperial Opera staged Alecko.
My goodness. And how old would he be at this point?
I think about 19.
Right.
But the inspiration for this work was a poem by Alexander Pushkin called The Gypsies. And like many operas, the story is one of love, betrayal, and murder. Now, while I know his piano works, I didn't realize how much vocal music he had written. And as it turns out, the piece that he valued the most from all of his work was an ambitious choral symphony called The Bells, based on 4 poems by Edgar Allan Poe.
This was also one that Rachmaninoff not only loved, but conducted a fair bit as well, too. And we'll get to his conducting in a bit, because I find it interesting that this young 19-year-old was writing such promising piano music as well as opera in such short periods of times that were being accepted and by professional companies and interested. People were profoundly interested in what this young man was doing.
Well, it's also interesting. He was a bit of a lapsed churchgoer in terms of the Russian Orthodox Church, but he also wrote some Vespers, which are very, very beautiful. But today, I think we're going to hear one of his songs, are we not?
We are.
Summer Nights.
Yes. And I think that it's fascinating to think of his capability as a song composer. This is really, really wonderful. People often speak about the concept of singing at the piano. And I don't mean in a Glenn Gould sense where you actually literally sing at the piano while
No.
people are trying to listen to what you're playing. But that concept that when you play a note, it sounds like the human voice.
I think that's why I like his music so much, because there is this line that if you close your eyes, you actually do find yourself singing along to it.
Absolutely. Well, these are some of the melodies of Rachmaninoff at the piano or in voice are absolutely breathtaking and so long and so beautifully crafted. He was a real expert at that. So I think it's fascinating to see what he actually did with a real human voice. I'm going to be playing from a recording that I did with a fabulous Canadian soprano, one of our country's treasures. This is Leslie Fagan, and this is a song called Summer Nights.
I'm looking forward to summer nights, let me tell you, getting outside.
Well, here's Rachmaninoff's version of Summer Nights.
Эти летние ночи прекрасная, ярким светом луны озаренная, порождают тревоги неясные, пробуждают порывы влюбленные. Забивается скорбь необъятная, что даруется жизнью немою, и блаженстве края благодатные раскрываются тайною силою. И открыли друг другу и властные над собою сердцами влюбленные. Эти летние ночи прекрасные цветом
Thank you, Leslie Fagan. That was Leslie Fagan and myself, Brian Finley, performing Summer Nights, Opus 14, number 5.
So, given all of this early success, life should have been a breeze for the youthful Sergei. But disaster struck with the premiere of his first symphony. The event took place in 1897 in St. Petersburg. And apparently, Rachmaninoff worried all through rehearsals. He felt, rightly so apparently, that the conductor didn't understand his music. But that was the least of the problems. Because during the performance, Sergei sat on a fire escape with his fingers in his ears. As the conductor, a rather drunk Alexander Glazunov, whom my husband once delivered the great line of, one glass was not enough, butchered his music. The critics were cruel, and the audiences didn't much like the piece either. A Russian composer claimed that the only audience that could really appreciate it would be the inhabitants of hell. It was another who said it was a symphony on the 7 plagues of Egypt. Rachmaninoff was crushed. He sank into a very deep depression and said that the symphony was weak, childish, strained, and bombastic.
Barb, let me read you what he wrote right at that time. He wrote, "My dreams of a brilliant career lay shattered. My hopes and confidence were destroyed. I felt like a man who had suffered a stroke and for a long time had lost the use of his head and hands."
Oh my goodness. Well, he withdrew it from public use, and it was never heard again in his lifetime. But what's really interesting is that it was when he left Russia, he had locked the score away in a drawer, and it stayed behind in Russia, and for years everyone assumed it had been lost. Then in 1944, individual orchestra parts were found, and the complete score was reconstructed. And in October 1945, the Moscow Conservatory played it.
Oh, so it's okay if I put my scores in a drawer somewhere in this house?
Yes. So he was right that the fault was not in the music. Well, I guess at some point he probably thought it was, but the fault was actually Glazounov's. And the problem was that more trouble followed. He was offered the chance to conduct an opera, something he'd never done before, and those rehearsals went badly. In an effort to cheer him up, his friends introduced him to Tolstoy, and they told the writer that their friend had lost his confidence and could he give him a pep talk. Well, I'm not so sure how much pep was in the talk. His encouragement came in the form of a lecture, and what he said to him was, "Do you imagine everything in life goes smoothly? All of us have difficult moments. That is life." Now, Rachmaninoff was about to endure another difficult moment, for he was invited to play. And he chose a piece called Fate, based on the opening of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. But no one had apprised the young man of Tolstoy's intense dislike of Beethoven. Tolstoy also reportedly asked of him if anybody really wanted to hear this modern sort of music. So I wonder what he would have made of the piece that I think you're going to play for us now, are you not?
I'm going to be playing the second prelude of Opus 23, the B-flat major prelude. And this is a total exuberance of pianistic style, of music, of joy, of light, of sunshine. It's one of the most amazing pieces, and it is chock-a-block full of notes. Here's where all 10 fingers are going all at the same time. But can you imagine when you put this kind of effort into not only writing something like this, but playing it, to have a reaction like Tolstoy's?
Yes.
Here's the B-flat prelude from Opus 23, number 2. was the Prelude in B flat, Opus 23, number 2. Vengeance is mine is a quote that Tolstoy used at the beginning of Anna Karenina. And this seemed to be a theme haunting Rachmaninoff.
Yes, and I just to go back to that, I mean, Tolstoy himself was rather a dark character. I'm not sure I would have suggested taking friends to him for encouragement, but anyway. But luckily, other friends provided more direct help. The railway industrialist Mamontov engaged him for the 1897-1898 Moscow private Russian opera season. This time, he got it right, and he had a successful debut at Queen's Hall, London in 1899. But his belief in his composing had not returned, and nothing came from his pen for 3 years. He said he was gripped by a fearful inertia. But then he met Dr. Nikolai Dahl, a psychologist trained in hypnosis. And whatever transpired in those visits, it worked. And Rachmaninoff began work on his second piano concerto, a piece which brought him international recognition and is still widely performed today. But before we get to that, I think that it's really worth mentioning that here was a man, he was a concert pianist, he was a composer, he was a conductor. You also do all three of those things. How hard is it to juggle that stuff?
Well, I haven't quite conducted any of my operas at the Bolshoi, Barb, so I just did.
Yes, but you have conducted.
Just point that out, first of all. I have conducted, yes, I have. And actually, I, like several of my colleagues, I'm really drawn to a multifaceted artistic career. I think it's a fascinating way to explore music, the expression of music. Both through the creation of it, the interpretation of other people's thoughts about it, leading others through it, and so on. There's so many different ways to explore. And, if you keep it all in the right balance, it's remarkably inspiring one against the other.
Well, his piano concerto number what we were talking about, number 2, right? It was premiered in 1901, and it was dedicated to the psychologist who would put him back on the path to composition.
Well, God bless Dr. Dahl.
Yeah, absolutely. And are we going to hear a little bit of this?
We are going to hear a little bit, just in case people can't remember how this one goes.
Okay.
Here is the second theme from the first movement of the Concerto Number 2 in C minor, Opus 18 by Rachmaninoff.
So, Brian, on the spectrum of music, there are a lot of people who would think of Rachmaninoff as being kind of a typical romantic composer. But there are other elements, correct?
There are, yes.
And how would those other elements be present in his piano concerto number 2, or are they?
Oh, they are, definitely. I mean, first of all, we're thinking this man composed, he self-proclaimed, from the heart and not from the head. But having said that, his music is so endowed with, just like Chopin's, keep coming back to that, with a logic and a perfect sense of craft. It's magnificently crafted. The counterpoint is beautifully done. It's full of surprises, but it's correct. So there's all kinds of things that are really interesting. Now, there's also a wonderful harmonic twist in that second theme I just played. And although it's not really unique to Rachmaninoff, it really feels like Rachmaninoff. And he exploited it in like no other composer. And you can find this harmony throughout a lot of his music. It's this chord. going to this chord, then going back to this chord. And here it is in that second theme. Now, what makes this sound so unique is that the second chord usually leads to this. Rachmaninoff. Quite a wonderful flavor. And it reminds me of another composer who did something equally daring, and that's Tchaikovsky, who loved these two chords as at the end of the first movement of the first piano concerto. Again, fabulous and unique flavors.
Did Rachmaninoff, is there a recording of Rachmaninoff himself playing this piano concerto?
Well, there is. He did record it a couple of times. And, to our ears, arguably, they seem on the quick side. So some people have actually wondered if the record companies were dictating the length to Rachmaninoff, or more the speed, I suppose. But I don't think so.
I wonder what he would think if he could hear some of the pianists today playing his music. I'm thinking of somebody like Evgeny Kissin.
That would be amazing. That would be great.
Well,
you're not sure. I mean, maybe he'd be out on the fire escape again with his fingers in his ears.
I don't think so. Because he now felt more secure in his future, he became engaged to his first cousin, Natalie Satina. But there were stumbling blocks because the Russian Orthodox Church had to issue marriage license, and since he was a lax churchgoer, finding a priest could be problematic. And added to that, the marriage of cousins required permissions from the Tsar. But if you remember, he came from an aristocratic family, and so he had an aunt who was able to pull some strings. And the couple married in May of 1903. And in 1904, he took the post of conductor at the Bolshoi Theater while continuing to compose two operas. One was called Francesca da Rimini, and the other one was called The Miserly Knight.
And am I correct that they could both be performed on the same evening? They're sort of
yes, they were both shorter.
Shorter operas, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Now, however, as we know, the political situation in Russia was changing. There was a lot of civil unrest, and it was becoming far more prominent. And apparently there was an outbreak in 1905, and the unrest spread to the orchestra. And Rachmaninoff found it impossible to control the musicians, so he resigned.
Well, that's one way of doing it.
But because of his worry over the political situation, he spent a lot of time outside the country. He spent winters in Dresden, with summers back in Russia at his wife's family's place. And in 1909, he toured the United States, playing only his own music.
And how was he received in the States?
Well, he had the recently finished Piano Concerto No. 3, which apparently is a taxing work for any pianist. And it premiered in New York with none other than Gustav Mahler at the podium.
And I think I remember that the first rehearsal for that concerto went way over time. Like it went hours and hours over time. And at one point, Rachmaninoff got up and went to the podium and had a chat with Mahler about a few details. And some musician way at the back of the orchestra started putting his instrument away, and Mahler stopped everybody and looked up and said, "Where do you think you're going? We're not finished yet." And of course, dutifully, on they went. And apparently they were all enchanted and went with it.
I was going to say, I guess they wouldn't have been unionized back in those days
either. Well, that's probably why they're unionized now.
Maybe. Now, his touring ended in 1914 with the outbreak of World War I, of course. And he and another very famous conductor named Sergei Koussevitzky, is that right?
Koussevitzky, yes.
Yeah, so during the war, they toured southern Russia, giving concerts for the war effort. But Rachmaninoff was also pretty shrewd, and he understood that the political scene was really deteriorating and that he should get out, because actually he said that he would not take political instructions from his houseboy. So he knew it was time to leave, and luckily...
Well, actually, and just as a thought there too, did he not have... had he not bought a motor car at that point? One of the first guys on the block with a motor car. And of course, with the motor car came the chauffeur. And I think there's a great picture of him driving his chauffeur around.
That's like my late husband used to say he was going to buy me a Blue Peak cap and he was going to sit in the back. But you have to remember, his family roots represented everything the Bolsheviks despised. They were landowners, they were aristocratic lineage, and of course he played what they considered to be Western-inspired music. But luckily for him, he received an invitation to Scandinavia in 1917, and he knew it was time to leave. But the family could tell no one of their plans, and so they had to pack as little as possible so as not to arouse suspicion. He carried only a small suitcase crammed with scores, and it wouldn't look too good dressed in those, I don't imagine. And after a train ride through Finland, they crossed the border to Sweden in a sleigh, if you can believe, in the middle of a snowstorm. But while he was in Sweden, he was contacted by American musicians about coming to the United States.
But here's a guy who's left his whole life behind, really. This is one of those stories, isn't it?
It is.
Where the pianos stay and the whole estate stays and that beautiful motor car and everything else that went with that life, all the Bolshoi things, and it's an amazing thing to flee from.
Well, they told him when he wanted to go to the United States that he could either conduct or tour. So he had to make a choice between performing, conducting, or composing. But this time, I think he was driven by a desire for financial security, which isn't surprising given that they had to leave everything, right?
Well, it's true,
so
and
that made the decision.
Yeah, and he had some pretty major offers in the United States too. He was offered the conducting post at Boston and in Cincinnati, amongst several others. So it was a big choice.
It was a big choice. And all through the 1920s and 30s, he virtually gave up composing for his concert tours. But it supplied him with enough money that he purchased a lakeside villa outside Lucerne, which he called Sonar, for Sergei and Natalie. And he also set up a publishing house in Paris, I believe, where he would feature the music of Russian composers, and he gave it the name of his two daughters, which I'm not sure what they were, but I know he combined their names again. Anyway, in the United States, he lived first in New York and then Los Angeles.
Well, now he arrived in New York, I think, in 1918 or so, and I think he arrive the day of the end of the war. And so there was a huge celebration when his ship pulled in.
I guess he thought he had really made it.
So he must have. Well, hopefully that cheered him up, and I think that was quite exciting. And people were very, very excited because there's a lot of displaced Europeans, of course, flooding into the States. So there was lots of these networks starting up.
There were the two things that happened too in that time. I think in one of those years, he wrote an article condemning the Soviet Union, and so for a while his music was banned, just like Shostakovich and just like everybody else's, until things opened up again in, I think, 1933, when the U.S. sort of reestablished relations and his music was allowed to be again. But the other thing is that you have to remember, he never really integrated into American society. Their social circle was other Russian immigrants, and for years he hoped the Soviet Union would end so that they could return home. And his home, I love this, his home was a complete replica of his home in Moscow.
Wow.
And many biographers think that homesickness contributed to a 15-year drought in composing. So in 1934, as you mentioned before, which was a very good year, he wrote his Rhapsody on a Theme by Paganini. In that time, he did the Corelli variations and the symphonic dances. He also wrote his Symphony No. 3. He recorded some of his major works, but by 1940, his health was beginning to fail. And his last performance was in Knoxville, Tennessee in February 1943, and they'd become American citizens only 16 days earlier.
My goodness. Well, it is interesting in context of his complete published works. He only had, they're magnificent pieces, but he only had 45 published works, and 38 of these were written in the first half of his career. So
yes.
Even though you rattled off quite a list of extremely impressive pieces, it had dwindled down quite quite a bit by that point.
Well, really interesting.
In
After
terms
he
of
moved
numbers,
to,
anyway.
in terms of not quality.
Exactly.
After he moved to Los Angeles, he met a number of his neighbors, many of whom were film stars. And I love this. One night he met Charlie Chaplin, and the two got into a discussion of religion. And Chaplin announced he was an atheist. Rachmaninoff, who himself rarely darkened the door of a church, replied, "But how can you have art without religion?" "I don't think we're talking about the same thing," said Chaplin. "Art is a feeling more than a belief." "So is religion," replied Rachmaninoff.
Touché.
Yes.
Well,
And
the
of course-
interesting thing is that apparently he loved the circus and Jack Benny. So I mean, there's always there's always fun little twists to these people.
Well, and you know, he was a terrible smoker. When he was composing as a young student, he said he used to go through 20 to 40 cigarettes a day.
Oh goodness.
So it's not surprising that his lungs got into difficulty. But I want to go on to something else that he influenced, because one of the most famous interpreters of Rachmaninoff's music was Van Cliburn. He, incidentally, was born in 1934, the year the Rhapsody was composed. But in 1958, after attending Juilliard and performing at Carnegie Hall, he entered the first international Tchaikovsky competition, a piano contest held in Moscow and designed to demonstrate Soviet cultural superiority.
Wow.
But at the finale, he played Tchaikovsky's Piano Concerto No. 1 and Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3. My, what a program that would have been, huh?
Wow.
And he earned a standing ovation lasting an amazing 8 minutes. This left the judges upset, because how could they demonstrate Soviet superiority when this Texan had clearly blown the other contestants out of the water? And so finally, they appealed directly to Nikita Khrushchev. And he said, "Is he the best?" And they said yes. And he said, "Then give him the prize." And he returned home a hero, earning the only New York City ticker tape parade ever held for a classical musician. And he made the cover of Time magazine with the headline, "The Texan Who Conquered Russia."
Wow, that's amazing. Not unlike the Canadian who was there the year before, 1957, Glenn Gould.
Exactly.
Or like the Canadian that went back a few years later, Andre Laplante, that also won the silver medal at the Tchaikovsky competition.
But you know what? In this time of our lives, I mean, we're all kind of experiencing some aspects of isolation in varying degrees. And I do think that a lot of Rachmaninoff's life was almost like a self-imposed isolation. I mean, especially when they came to the States, I mean, this man was Russian through and through. I mean, he loved Russian music. He loved the Tchaikovsky. And here he was in a foreign country. Couldn't be easy. And yet he supplied us with some absolutely spectacularly beautiful music.
Yeah, incredibly so. Let me read a quote about one of his performances in the States. This is from 1935, his 1935 New York recital. And this is just an interesting thing in reference of what you just said about this feeling of isolation, this feeling of keeping all this inside. This is what it was like to attend a Rachmaninoff recital. The bell rings, and a very tall, spare, grave gentleman in afternoon garb of irreproachable correctness and sobriety steps, without smiling, upon the stage. He seats himself at the piano and plays. He does not smile once through the whole occasion. In no way does he gesticulate or parade. All that he communicates, he says, with 2 wrists and 10 fingers, without the raising of an eyebrow. The performance is one of mind sovereign over matter, spirit that transfigures digital gymnastics. So it has always been with Rachmaninoff, and so it will be for the years to come.
Wow. Well, I find it very interesting, because for a long time he was considered a throwback to the Romantic era who was left behind by other more progressive composers. But Ted Libby says this composer has often been dismissed by critics and musical scholars as second-rate, and that is an assessment that can no longer be defended.
That's very true. It's also conspicuous by what's missing. For example, Aaron Copland's book, we talked about this last with the Gould podcast. Aaron Copland's book, The New Music, 1900 to 1960, doesn't even mention Rachmaninoff. It's not even in the index. It's just an amazing thing missing. The Groves Encyclopedia, the Dictionary of Music and Musicians, in 1954, said that Rachmaninoff's music was effective but monotonous in texture, and consisted in essence mainly of artificial and gushing tunes accompanied by a variety of figures derived from arpeggios. The enormous popular success some few of Rachmaninoff's works have had in his lifetime is not likely to last.
Wow.
And thankfully this was corrected in the 2001 edition somewhat, but even in a guarded sense, where it says he used his own standing as a performer not to write music of unreasonably empty virtuosity, but rather to explore fully the expressive possibilities of his instrument. And its most inspired, Rachmaninoff's lyrical inspiration is matchless. Even the textures formerly damned as monotonous now are hailed as subtly varied and carefully contrasted.
It's interesting because I wonder if these people had asked pianists who have played him if they would agree with that assessment.
Or public who
loved
really
it.
Enjoy it.
Yes.
I find this interesting too, that Aaron Copland does say about music of this part of time, 1900s, early 1900s. Modern music, in a word, is principally the expression in terms of an enriched musical language of a new spirit of objectivity attuned to our own times. So the concept of objectivity and our own times were not necessarily things that applied to Rachmaninoff.
And yet I think that in these particular times that we're in right now, to listen to that beautiful soaring melody in the 18th variation is just an uplifting experience.
Absolutely. I think we really need it.
I think so
and
too.
once again, history is going to be the judge of this contribution.
Absolutely. Again, Brian, been a lot of fun talking to you.
Oh, it's been great, Barb. I guess there's nothing left to do but rush out and listen to some Rachmaninoff.
Absolutely. Yes, and you can find all kinds of pianists playing his stuff on YouTube, and it's worth the listen.
Thank you so much for joining us, Barb. We always have a delightful conversation. So let's keep the conversation going. Drop us a note to add to the conversation, or even tell us about what other things you would like us to discuss, and we'll certainly put that in the mix. So connect with us at westben@westben.ca. Thanks a million, Barb. And we're going to leave today with not the prelude, but another one of the most magnificent preludes. This is the prelude in D major, opus 23, number 4, by Rachmaninoff.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Music for a While with Barb Hobart and Brian Finley. This episode is sponsored by Cameco. Cameco has donated over $24 million to various organizations and community groups in our area since 2009. Their community investment program focuses on youth, education and literacy, health and wellness, and community development. We are very grateful for their support this year. Thank you also to our Galaxy sponsors, Finley and Associates, for their continued support. Finley and Associates is a management consulting firm located in Calgary, Alberta. They strive to spark collaborative results, transforming organizations and their leaders for growth and sustainability. Their clients are family offices, closely held organizations, and research and culture organizations. And we are very grateful for all of their guidance and support through sponsorship. To continue the conversation and be featured in the next episode of Mailbag, submit your stories and questions via westben@westben.ca. Be sure to subscribe to the West Bend YouTube channel to stay in the loop and get notified when we post new videos. Feel free to like and share this video to help the West Bend family grow. Remember, there is sunshine ahead.